One was Ukraine's neutrality, so non-NATO, neutral, number one. Number two, that Russia would continue to hold Crimea, whether by agreement or de facto. Russia views Crimea as a particular matter of national security for a true reason, which is that since 1783, that's the place of its naval base in the Black Sea, and that is central to Russia's national security. And I think that that's true. And the third was that the Minsk II agreement to address the Donbass would be implemented. And the Minsk II agreement came in 2014 and 2015 after the events of 2014 to give autonomy to the Donbass. And that's where the heavy Russian-speaking population is, and that's the site of the war right now. And the idea was that there would be some kind of constitutional autonomy, and this was signed by Ukraine and guaranteed by Germany and France in the so-called Normandy process. It was never implemented. My Ukrainian counterparts tell me, of course we would never implement that. We signed it, yes, but we would never implement it. A few weeks ago, former Chancellor Merkel, who was a guarantor of the agreement, she said, I don't even know whether it's true now what she said or what she said then. She said, no, it was a holding period to allow Ukraine to strengthen itself. We didn't expect it to be implemented, which is a remarkable statement to make because Germany was a guarantor of the agreement. That means that they're supposed to ensure that it's implemented. Whatever the case, those three positions that Putin put on the table at the end of 2021 made sense. They really made sense because not expanding NATO, in my view, is not a concession, it's common sense. Do you actually really want to provoke a conflict, or do you want to keep a safe space? I say keep a safe space. So that one wasn't a concession, that just made sense to me. Crimea makes sense to me also, I have to say, that fighting to take it back could lead us to nuclear war, and we should understand the practicalities of this. And what Yanukovych was trying to do in 2011 was to negotiate a long-term lease arrangement with Russia that would last at least till 2041. Well, that would have been smart, but he was under a lot of Western pressure. And then Minsk II, sign, implemented. Well, we turned down that basis. So everything got worse. Everything's worse. Not only have hundreds of thousands of people died, we don't know how many, and massive destruction by now, but Russia annexed 4 regions. Okay, this makes it a lot harder. We don't even know what diplomacy would exactly mean right now. But to my mind, we remain 3 core issues. And the core issues are neutrality or NATO enlargement is one issue. The second issue is Crimea. And the third issue is Donbass, but unfortunately now with the Kherson region and Zaporozhye region thrown into this terrible mix. But what does it mean? In my view, it means that what this war is about is politics. It's not about some crazy, it's not about, in my opinion, Putin thinking he's Peter the Great. It's not about the Western propaganda. It's not about Hitler in 1938. It's actually about NATO and Ukraine and all these issues which have been on the table for 30 years. So we should face them politically. And this is, I think, what Clausewitz meant by his most famous expression, that war is politics with other means. In other words, we're still dealing with politics, so we need to have a political discussion about this right now.
So you mentioned in one of your recent articles that neutral countries, including those of the Global South, can play an important role in this. Again, the world has changed tremendously since the beginning of this latest era, the end of history, and so on and so forth. So you have a different global layout when it comes to economic power. And G7 is on the one hand, and then you have BRICS and the rest of the Global South. So how do you see the role of the Global South, and BRICS in particular, in balancing out the future of world, both security and economy?
My view is that the whole world plays a role in ending this conflict for one very basic reason. If the world really subscribed to the American and European narrative, that this is an unprovoked war, that there are no issues, that Russia just needs to leave, and that it's horrendous crimes and so forth, if that were the view around the world world would have joined in the sanctions, and Russia really would not have been able to carry on a war. It wouldn't have changed the regime and so forth, as I mentioned, even with Maduro. But Russia has been able to do what it does because it's got friends all over the world that don't subscribe to the dominant EU-US narrative. They think everybody agrees with them, but that's basically because they listen to themselves. They're not talking with the rest of the world. I am talking with a lot of world leaders who say, yeah, this is a contest between the US and Russia. We don't want to take sides in that. So my point has always been, at least make it clear that this is not a war about NATO enlargement, is what I've said to the US, for example, from December 2021 onward. Say NATO isn't enlarging, and that if Putin invades, there's no provocation for that. Make it clear. No, we won't make it clear. The door is open. It's an open door policy. Well, come on. They can't even win the international support on that because it's quite logical that it is a NATO enlargement war. And they don't say, they won't admit that, or they won't deny that. They won't say anything about it. So this is my point about why these other countries. Let's get things on the record. Is the US wanting to enlarge NATO? If they had any sense at all, they would say no. It was a terrible idea in 2008, and we understand it's a terrible idea. It crosses the red line of a major power that has 1,700 nuclear weapons. Thank you. It wasn't such a good idea. So just like in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have a compromise to create some space, exactly the way the crisis was solved 60 years ago. If they said that, and there were negotiations that made all of this clear, and the whole rest of the world said, you know, now this makes sense, and we will hold accountable the party that breaks this agreement, then you're talking, because then just willfully invading the other side in complete contradiction to what you've agreed really would provoke a worldwide storm. And that's what I'm basically proposing, which is that there are plenty of countries that are ready to guarantee an agreement, and countries that matter. And let me take the case of China, for example. What is China's position on this war? China does not want this war. Of course, China doesn't want Russia to lose this war and NATO to win, especially because, unbelievably, the Secretary General of NATO today is in Asia to try to make a NATO-Asia alliance against China. Duh. Excuse me. What does NATO stand for? North Atlantic. Does it stand for World War III? Does it stand for U.S. Expeditionary Force? No, it stands for North Atlantic. It was to guard against an invasion by the Soviet Union, which I guarantee is not going to happen because it doesn't exist anymore. So why is the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, in Korea today? Because they have no restraint. Because now NATO wants to take a position against China, which is a kind, it's really, okay, I'm coming back to your question. So what does all this mean? Put reasonable terms on the table, agree on reasonable terms, and then reasonable nations will help to ensure those terms. And the reason I was mentioning China is that China has said all along, we want the war to stop, which they really do, when I talk to a lot of Chinese senior officials, but we want Russia's security interests to be respected as well. In the West, that's regarded as ludicrous, but what it really means is no NATO enlargement, which is neither ludicrous nor of uninterest to China, which doesn't like NATO exactly right now, especially since they're traipsing around East Asia to try to organize an alliance against China. So all of this is to say there are lots of important countries in the world that actually want peace. And I mentioned Argentina, Brazil, India, which is president of the G20 this year, China, South Africa. They're not warmongers. They're not anti-Ukraine. They just happen also not to be anti-Russia. And they could help to guarantee a peace. But to guarantee a peace, there has to be a clear agreement. What does each side say? The U.S. side has to say, we will not enlarge NATO. And the Russian side has to say, we will put our troops home. Those are the 2 points. That's observable. And I think the world could help to enforce such a basic agreement. Yeah, I think it's exactly the right analogy. When did World War I start? Did it start on June 28th with the assassination of the Archduke? Did it start on July 28th with the declaration of war by Austria against Serbia? Did it start 10 years earlier when military alliances were secretly made that led to the triggering of disaster? Of course, there are roots to any conflict. And even the dating that we give to the Ukraine war in most of the Western media is simply false on its surface, but it also disguises the antecedent causes. This war started in February 2014. We say it started in February 2022, typically, that Putin, without provocation, because he's a madman and wanted to recreate the Russian Empire in his fantasies, launched an unprovoked war on February 24th, 2022. That's just propaganda. That's not even factual about when the fighting started, because the fighting started in 2014, not in 2022. And it raged, actually, between 2014 and 2022. So even the simple fact of when the war started was that it started 8 years earlier. And of course, why the war started 8 years earlier is heavily contested, but I'll give you my 5-minute view, and that is that from 1990 onward, we failed to endorse adopt and build on Gorbachev's vision of a common European home, and instead the U.S. set up a vision of a U.S.-led unipolar world and believed that the Cold War was won by a U.S. victory rather than achieved by a diplomatic settlement. In fact, the U.S. did not defeat the Soviet Union. Gorbachev unilaterally said we should end the Cold War. We want to reform. We're going to disband the Warsaw Pact because we don't want to address our issues through military means. And he was told in 1990, okay, if you do that, Germany wants to reunify, but we commit to not expanding our military alliance, NATO, in place of what was the Warsaw Pact. And a famous promise was made that we will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. And by the way, I always like to say in my talks, if you want documentary evidence, my email is sachs@columbia.edu, and I'll be happy to refer you to the archival material that documents this, because this is all denied now by the United States, which likes a politics of amnesia rather than a politics of memory in this case. So the U.S. promised no NATO enlargement. By 1992, the neoconservatives in the United States, which means the hawkish or war party, was in power. Remember Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld, and then they were followed by the Democratic Party side of the war party, which is Madeleine Albright, Richard Holbrooke, and others. So it's both parties. It's not one party or another party. They said, no, we won. It's a unipolar world. Anyway, Soviet Union's finished. We don't have any commitments to keep. And so Bill Clinton started the NATO enlargement in the mid-1990s. And really smart people knew at the time, this is reckless. This is dangerous. It's a cheat, and it's also a provocation. And so that went on for a long time. By the way, when President Putin came to power in 1999, he was not anti-European. He was not anti-American. He expected cooperation. But he said, stop the NATO enlargement because, you know, we have interests and we don't want your military on our border. Then came 9/11. The neocons went into absolute preeminence. Cheney basically ran the security state of the United States from 2001 to 2008. He was a very dangerous person. He said if there's 1% risk of something, you have to treat it like it's 100% chance. You know, if Saddam has 1% chance of having nuclear weapons, you have to treat it like it's certainty. That's a little crazy, by the way, in decision analysis. You don't treat a 1% as 100%, but you do create a lot of wars if you do that. So all the wars started. And the NATO enlargement continued in 2004, 7 more countries. The Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia. And then in 2007, Putin said, no more. So George W. Bush in 2008 said, yes, more. Ukraine and Georgia. This was not prudent. Prudence, prudentia, is a Latin word meaning practical good judgment. And it comes from a Greek word called sophrosony, which means wisdom. This is not wisdom. This is stupid. And that's what they announced in Bucharest 2008. And many European leaders said to me at the time, what is he doing? We're against this. But one thing, this is the continuing slide into this, and I'll just finish with 2 quick points on this. In 2014, the U.S. helped overthrow the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. We know it from many means. I know it because I happen to see things that I wish I hadn't seen. But the U.S. was part of this overthrow. Putin didn't like that either, because Yanukovych was actually rather cleverly trying to balance 2 giants. On the one side, the West saying you must do this and you must do that. On the other side, Russia saying you must do this and must do that. And Yanukovych's position was, we're neutral, thank you, we're neutral. That was rather intolerable to the United States. Neutrality doesn't work in the U.S. mindset, because you're either with us or you're against us. And so they helped to overthrow him in February 2014. That's when the war started. And between 2014 and 2021, there was fighting the whole time, but the U.S. put in billions of dollars of weaponry, and the Ukrainians built fortifications along this line that we're seeing the front line. That didn't just start a few months ago. That was 8 years of fortifying the eastern Ukraine with American finance and know-how and weaponry. So at the end of 2021, after Biden had come into office, Putin said, look, you crossed every red line, but our red line is NATO stops its enlargement. You stop trying to get military bases on our borders. You stop putting weapon systems that can hit us in a few minutes, and we discuss it. And the White House answer was, nothing to discuss. And we're certainly not going to talk about NATO enlargement. And then the war, the invasion came on February 24th, 2022. So if ever there was a series of missed opportunities over 30 years to avoid a conflict, this is it. And that's why I'm deeply unimpressed by an analysis that said this war started on February 24th, 2022 by an unprovoked attack by President Putin. It's just not true. It started because of a buildup of conflict over a 30-year period and lots of cheating, I'm afraid, by the United States side. And that brings us to our mess right now.
So we are, Jeff, where we are right now, and obviously this angle is something that is fiercely opposed by official capital views of the European Union and Washington as well. But the fact of life is that a set of very harsh economic sanctions were imposed on the Russian Federation unilaterally by the United States and the European Union. And as both economist and an intellectual, what's your take on these sanctions? How effective?
Those are opposites, by the way, economist and intellectual.
Intellectual. Well,
Just
try
to make the point.
try to be both in answering this, but and why do you think that majority of world nations don't seem to have been ready to support this course of action, at least not so far?
First, on the sanctions, you know, the United States uses sanctions a lot. It's an interesting policy. They use it a lot because it's without any direct budget outlay, and it can do a lot of damage. And it doesn't require any public debate. It doesn't require any congressional approval. The public doesn't even understand what it is, but who cares? It's not their business. This is purely the president by signing a document. And the U.S. uses these unilateral sanctions. This is different from sanctions approved by the UN. That's a different matter, because the Security Council can vote sanctions under the UN Charter. But this is the US using its sanctions, and they do it a lot. The one thing I would observe about this is they almost never work in geopolitical terms. And I've watched for years the use of sanctions by the US as a cheap, easy policy fail time and again. One was the United States, in one of the most ridiculous foreign policy moves you can imagine, suddenly decided under Trump to declare that the president of Venezuela wasn't the president, but the president that the United States said was the president. So the United States one day announced, Maduro is not president, Guaido is president. It's in English we would say pretty ballsy. That you just announce one day who the other country's president actually is. It's a strange kind of foreign policy. Anyway, they said, okay, since Maduro's not president, he can't have any access to foreign exchange reserves anymore. He can't Venezuela won't be allowed to fix its oil drilling and so forth. So by stroke of a pen, they put on these unilateral sanctions. It actually worked in one sense. It completely crushed the Venezuelan economy, which declined by more than 50% in GDP, extraordinary decline. What didn't work is Maduro's still there, of course. And Guaido, by the way, was thrown out even by the opposition, saying, no, he's not our president anymore. The whole thing was absurd. It was worse than a high school play, actually. Oh, you're not student council president, he is. Yeah, but he won the vote. No, it doesn't matter. But anyway, they did this, but it didn't work geopolitically. It didn't end Maduro's government. In fact, in a way, he said, look, all this economic crisis caused by the gringos in the north, which was pretty accurate description, after all. It was the United States that did this. So now, by the way, the White House sends its emissaries to Maduro. Would you pump more oil because we have to replace the Russian oil? So now they're trying to become buddies with Maduro again. But the point is, it didn't work. And no US sanctions regime that I know of in recent years has come close to working. So that's a starting point. So as soon as the US put on sanctions on Russia, I talked to a very senior official and I said, this isn't going to work. It doesn't work. This time it was worse though, because not only did it not cripple the Russian economy, the boomerang effect, which didn't apply in Venezuela so much, because you could crush Venezuela without the whole world feeling it, applied in the case of Russia, which is it's led to tremendous global negative consequences. So it didn't stop Russia from exporting all over the world. And I'll come to your question, why? But it also hurt Europe a lot because Europe's told, no, you can't buy the low-cost energy that your industry has built upon. So the effects were quite serious, and we haven't seen the last of those effects yet. But when the sanctions were imposed, it was the US and always the Anglo-Saxon world, so that's the US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. That's a block of the security system of the US. Then the EU, okay? Then Japan, Korea, and Singapore. That's basically it. That's roughly 20% or so of the world population, roughly speaking. Maybe a little bit less, actually. And most of the rest of the world said, we don't want to get into this. We trade with Russia, we trade with Ukraine. We're not party to this conflict. We think this conflict should stop with negotiations. And so most of the world does not want this. Of course, a lot of the world's afraid of the U.S. secondary sanctions, but the vast majority of the world doesn't agree with these sanctions and doesn't even agree with the idea that any country can just decide to impose these sanctions, which are illegal in international law, after all. There's no legal basis for one country to say, stop trading with all those other countries. You can't do that. But they're a little afraid, but they don't impose the sanctions. This is the basic reason why Russian economy has done fine during the past year, because China trades with Russia, India trades with Russia, all the Asian countries trade with Russia, the Latin American countries trade with Russia. Today, Chancellor Scholz has been in South America, and he's being told by the South American leaders, don't pull us into this. We're not going to send arms to Ukraine. They trade with Russia, but they also trade with Ukraine, by the way. They don't want to be in this proxy war. So that's the main reason. And they don't view it like the U.S. thought automatically they would view it, that this is an unprovoked attack. I speak to world leaders all over the world, and they understand full well this is a confrontation of two superpowers, not one side launching a war. And they want both sides to back off.
Well, I take all of this very seriously because we have a war between two nuclear superpowers. So this is a terrible situation. This is a war between Russia and the United States. The U.S. Does not have that many people on the ground. We don't know who really is on the ground in Ukraine from the U.S., but a lot of weapons are, finance, intelligence. This is, the U.S. is fighting this war, and this is quite clear, and that means two sides, each that have arsenals of 1,600 or so active nuclear weapons in a war that is of tremendous significance for Russia on its border, and so far where the United States is saying we will continue to do whatever it takes to defeat Russia. Well, when you have superpowers talking in that way, you better damn take it as a big threat. And I have not appreciated the U.S. policies in this all along, because I think I'm actually a little relieved in a weird way that Biden said this, because I felt this all along. I felt that the U.S. policy was on a path of escalation and that they didn't have an off-ramp in their minds. By the way, there's an obvious off-ramp, and this is the whole point of this war, if you really know something about it from the beginning. And the off-ramp is that NATO says we're not going to enlarge to Ukraine, period. That was the off-ramp that would have prevented the war. That was the off-ramp that would have stopped this war in March, when Russia and Ukraine, under the mediation of Turkey, exchanged documents and said publicly, as well as the Turkish mediators, we're close to an agreement. Many of us think that the U.S. rushed in and said, oh, no, don't do that. You know, we don't know ever with our government what's really going on, because they don't tell the truth. That just goes with the business of government, the way that it's viewed in Washington. But my feeling is that there are a lot of signs that the U.S. has been against a negotiated end to this war, because my interpretation is that this issue of NATO enlargement is a deeply held objective of the United States going back to the early 1990s. It's as deeply rejected by Russia since that time. I've watched it on both sides. That's why we have a collision course that continues to escalate, and why we should take damn seriously this nuclear threat. But why Biden should ask himself, okay, well, good, he's asking what's the off-ramp, I'll give him the suggestion. We should never have suggested NATO enlargement to Ukraine, and we should stop now, because Putin was very clear at the end of 2021. Here are my red lines, and the core of them, the core of the red lines was neutrality of Ukraine. And I called the White House then. I said, that's good. That's actually right. That's not just a concession. That is right for all sides. The White House said, yeah, we don't like that. We believe Ukraine has the right to join NATO. I said, it's not a right because it impinges directly on Russia's core security perceptions. You better talk. No, we're not talking about that. Well, they better talk. That's my bottom line. They really had better talk about this issue. By the way, you can't have Zelensky negotiating with Putin. This is a war between the U.S. and Russia. And we need to have the President of the United States and the President of Russia talking with each other and avoiding Armageddon. That's, I think, the bottom line.
And Zelensky, by the way, said he wouldn't even negotiate with Russia insofar as Putin is in power. So Zelensky's taking care of that problem already, I guess.
Look, you know, I've studied the Cuban Missile Crisis all my life, all my professional adult life. I wrote a book about the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I've looked at this issue in great detail. We came close to nuclear Armageddon exactly 60 years ago this month, by the way. And during that period, one of the provocations was Castro saying, fire, telling Khrushchev, make a preemptive strike, just what Zelensky's doing right now. You could kind of understand it, but you know what Khrushchev said when Castro said, you should make a preemptive strike? Khrushchev said, my God, this is supposedly our ally who would end the world. We better negotiate. We better speed up the negotiations because this is not stable. And when Zelensky says these things, I'm horrified. And yeah, they walked it back, but he didn't say sanctions, by the way. He said preemptive strike, and Zelensky has said similar things. And they talk recklessly, maybe understandably given their circumstance. I don't think so. I don't like it. And I think it shows how unstable this is. And by the way, during this whole period of this proxy war where this is really a confrontation between Russia and the United States, we have pretended that it's a confrontation only between Russia and Ukraine, first of all. And we've said constantly, whatever Ukraine says, this is, that's the right thing. And so we're kind of giving carte blanche to the most extravagant, dangerous, provocative statements. And another example, okay, we don't know for 100%, but let me do a little quiz. Russia is in control right now of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. It is being shelled. We hear that's very dangerous, which it is. You shouldn't shell nuclear power plants. Now, one side controls the plant. So who is actually shelling the plant? Well, our media say, oh, we don't know who's shelling the plant. And they can't put one and one together to say, well, if Russia's in control of the plant, maybe they're not shelling their own plant. Maybe it's Ukraine shelling the plant. Well, I can tell you, I speak to a lot of people. It's almost surely Ukraine shelling the power plant. And we can't bring ourselves to express a simple truth. And that hurts because they continue to shell the power plant with impunity. And we should say, stop shelling the power plant. Yes, it would be good if you had control of the power plant, we can say to them, but don't shell a nuclear power plant. But we can't even find those words. That's the problem, because we're kind of faking the whole thing as if this isn't a US-Russia thing. Then we say, okay, do it, go, defeat Putin, that's great, that's what we want. Defeat the guy with 1,600 active nuclear warheads and several thousand more in reserve. Go ahead, go do it. As if this isn't our Armageddon that we're heading to. And that's really been a massive failure of this administration till now. One thing I've learned I'm 67 years old. I've been through a lot of US wars. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Nicaragua, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, and more. It's the job of the President of the United States to put on the brakes, because this country is a war machine at the top. We don't see it. We don't know it exactly. Eisenhower told us about it with the military-industrial complex. This country is a war machine. The main job of the President of the United States is to stop the war machine from making wars. And we are now in an escalation heading towards Armageddon, according to the president. That's not a spectator sport. That's his job, to keep us away from Armageddon.
And Professor Sachs, you said this is a war between the US and Russia. We've heard threat after threat or call after call for an end to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, from Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland to Joe Biden himself. Senator Ron Johnson, in questioning Nuland, appeared to actually call for the sabotage of the pipeline.
But I'm literally talking about rolling back the pipeline. And loosely define that, but I mean taking action that will prevent it from ever becoming operational.
So who do you think is responsible for the worst act of industrial sabotage in recent memory, and maybe in long memory? And what would their motive be, considering that the German economy was on the hook here?
You know, I've said I wasn't there, but my guess is, just like I think Ukraine is shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, I think the United States blew up Nord Stream. And they told us. Biden said it in February, said if Putin invades, Nord Stream is over. And then a reporter said, well, what do you mean, Mr. President? How are you going to do that? He said, we have our ways. We have our ways.
We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
Come on. Who controls the airspace? Who monitors the airspace? Who has the means to do this? Who said we're going to do it? Who said afterwards, this is a tremendous opportunity, this new situation, a tremendous opportunity to permanently wean Europe from Russian gas? That would be Secretary of State Blinken. Who said, thank you, USA, tweeting a picture of the burst pipeline? That would be Radek Sikorski, former foreign minister of Poland. And by the way, I've been in touch with reporters in papers that say we don't know, or even worse, who say Russia did this. And then I talk to very senior reporters, and they say, Jeff, of course it's the U.S. What do you think? But it doesn't get into our news. My guess is that we're going to hear from Europe's investigators in a week or so. Very hard. We don't know. Trail went cold. Very hard to tell. We'll keep looking, but we don't know. But terrible blow, terrible blow. That would be consistent with the U.S. doing it. And the fact that things went a bit quiet after this, rather than parliamentarians throughout Europe demanding our core infrastructure was blown up, tells me that they're told, keep it quiet, keep it quiet. We don't really want to know exactly what happened. So I can't prove this, but it sure does, to my mind, put all the suspicion on the U.S. side. Warnings, motive, capability, subsequent behavior, strange statements. To my mind, it adds up. I don't think Russia would blow up its core infrastructure. That doesn't make sense. And anyone else that did it would, with Poland or Denmark or anyone else, that would be NATO, that would be with the US.
President Joe Biden has said, Professor Sachs, that there will be an investigation into what he has deemed an act of deliberate sabotage. He said he'll send divers down, which is interesting because he knows that divers can reach it. but do you think that this investigation will be a whitewash like the kind we saw the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons carry out, where inspectors were actually censored and even attacked by OPCW leadership around the Duma Syria chemical weapon attack allegations in April 2018? And what do you make specifically of that allegation? My colleague here, Aaron Mate, has done as much to expose the cover-up as anyone, so it's a real issue of interest here.
Well, on this, the pipeline, the U.S. can't be the one investigating if the U.S. is the most likely culprit. I mean, they can, but we're not going to find any credibility in what comes out of this. So I think the idea of an independent and transparent investigation would be great, but I'm not holding my breath. So the U.S. may say something. Again, I'm 67 years old. It took me a long time to grow up to know that almost everything we hear is not true. We are a security state. We have a secret state, which runs most of our foreign and military policy, of course, and we don't hear the real thing. So I'm not putting too much stock in what the U.S. comes up with. I'm a little more curious about what the Europeans say. It's their infrastructure, after all. It's their economy. It's their gas pipeline. And you would think that they might be interested in actually knowing. But what's also true is that if they do find out or they do know, which I presume they do, they're not speaking also because, the U.S. they think is their security umbrella. I think the U.S. is the great provocation that threatens Europe just about as much as anything right now. So I don't know if we'll ever find out the truth, but frankly, there are so many issues that we never find out the truth about because we never really look. And when you have a state based on secrecy and impunity and, like in Love Story, never having to say you're sorry, the CIA doesn't say, oh, we made a mistake, so sorry, let's have a careful review of what we've done. We're not going to find out about Syria. We're not going to find out about this, not from the U.S. at least. On Syria and the chemical weapons, I listen to you guys. I'm not enough of an expert or inside to know, but what I do know as a very basic point, the U.S., of course, really instigated the war in Syria in 2011. It was the plan, like 100 times before, to overthrow Assad. President Obama signed a presidential finding to task the CIA to work with Saudi Arabia and others to overthrow Assad. This was Operation Timber Sycamore. What is amazing to me about the whole thing is that there's almost not been any coverage, review, explanation of this. We heard only this is a civil war. That's what we heard again and again. And then we hear even more extraordinarily, Putin intervened in Syria. Look what the Russians have done. Putin intervened years after the U.S. took action to overthrow Russia's ally. But we can't get this story told. I think the New York Times covered Operation Sycamore one day, if I remember, something around 2016. Nothing beforehand, nothing after. And I knew a lot about this in those years at the time because I knew what was happening through diplomatic channels and so forth. It was like reality here, weirdness of our mainstream media here, and a narrative that was completely devoid of facts for years. And newspapers that are, of course, absolutely counter-informative.
Quick question on Ukraine before we move on to other topics. What do you think guides the U.S. officials who are overseeing the current policy? I mean, we had someone like Lindsey Graham recently say that as long as the U.S. arms Ukraine, they will fight to the last person.
4 months into this thing, I like the structural path we're on here. As long as we help Ukraine with the weapons they need and the economic support, they will fight to the last person.
Do you think that's the prevailing mentality right now? And why are they so determined to sacrifice Ukraine in this war against Russia?
And if I could piggyback on that question, Professor Sachs, since you mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis and your understanding of it, throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy brothers, John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, were pushing back against the Joint Chiefs. Then later in Vietnam, although LBJ was going along with the Joint Chiefs, he was listening to character figures like George Ball, Assistant Secretary of State, who was an opponent of the war. Do you have any insight into the thinking of the Biden administration? And is there anyone there who is resisting this drive towards nuclear escalation?
I think that the core motivation of the U.S. goes back to the neocon approach to foreign policy, which basically has been the approach of the United States for 30 years now. At the end of the Soviet Union, the neocons took power, they're still in power, and their view is the U.S. is the unipolar power, it's the sole superpower, and we're going to keep it that way. And under U.S. strategic doctrines right now, there are two threats. Russia is one and China is the other. And it's not an accident that we're in confrontations on two fronts right now. So when it comes to Russia, Zbig Brzezinski pretty much spelled this out in his very interesting book, The Global Chessboard, Grand Chessboard, A Global Chessboard, 1997, where he said that Ukraine is the geographical pivot of Eurasia. It's the key. If the United States is basically in charge, Russia ceases to be even a regional power, basically. It's cut out from the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. Ukraine's a big prize if you're a neocon. And a neocon is someone who views the world like the game of Risk, that you want to get all your pieces on the board and you want to take all of your opponent's pieces off the board. And Ukraine is really strategic from their point of view. And this has been spelled out by Robert Kagan, for example. They've written about this quite openly. And of course, that family has been part of this for the whole time, because Victoria Nuland is the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs in the United States right now. She's been through all these administrations. And so I think that this is the core, that we're going to expand NATO. They have the idea that the North Atlantic reaches to Georgia. Now, that's an interesting idea. That was George Bush's geographical insight in 2008. Extraordinarily cynical, but if you look at a map, what's the game plan? The game plan is control the Black Sea. It is Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, all surrounding Russia, where their naval fleet is. So that's what Brzezinski was outlining back in 1997. Now, they thought they could kind of slip it in without, Russia being able to oppose it, because they kept expanding NATO step by step. First, the three, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, by the way, against the promise, the clear, unequivocal promise to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand to the east. And like so many other things, the US government said, oh, we never said that. Well, they're liars. Of course they said it. And there's a full documentary record, easily accessible on the web, to understand what was said. So, long and the short of it is, that's been the game plan for 30 years. And it's had its ups and downs, because Ukraine itself is internally divided between East and West. And so the presidents have gone back and forth, pro-Russia, anti-Russia. And when a pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, came in 2010, after Bush had invited Ukraine into NATO, over the opposition, by the way, of European leaders, but this is a US-led alliance, Yanukovych guided neutrality through the Ukrainian parliament. That stabilized things for a little while, until Yanukovych was overthrown. Overthrown by whom? Well, according to the US narrative, oh, the masses on the streets. According to what I saw with my own eyes, we stirred a lot of the pot and paid for a lot of that overthrow. I don't know how much. Everything's a lie. Everything's hidden. But the Russians say that was a coup that the US led. I can't tell you exactly the US role, but we heard Victoria Nuland on the tape describing the formation of the new government and other choice words for our European allies. And I know with my own eyes, by the way, about US involvement in that. Not my involvement. I saw it. I was, oh my God, that's pretty weird what's going down. And this is Russia's point, which is, okay, you broke it again. Now, because as soon as that, as Yanukovych went down, the new government said, we want NATO. And then the US started pouring in the weapons, billions of dollars during the Trump years. Then Biden came and I thought, my God, maybe we'll get some sanity. Of course, he doubled down 3 times in 2021. At the highest levels, we said Ukraine will be a member of NATO in the NATO annual meeting, in a State Department strategic document with Ukraine, and in a Defense Department strategic document. So we doubled down. That's when I called the White House at the end of the year, please take the off-ramp. But they don't want to take the off-ramp. Now we're close to Armageddon, we're told. There is an off-ramp. We better take the off-ramp. We better start talking rather than just escalating. Well, the UN means 2 things, first of all. It means its member states. That's 193 countries. And then there is the UN system of organizations and agencies and so forth. The real political base of the UN is its members. And in 2 senses, there's the General Assembly, which includes all countries, 1 country, 1 vote. And then there's the Security Council. The Security Council is where war and peace issues are supposed to be addressed. There are 5 permanent members of the Security Council, each with a veto: the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK, and then 10 rotating countries for a total of 15. So when we say the UN should do more, the answer to my mind is yes, but that means several different things. It means the member states, it means the UN Security Council, it means the leadership of the UN, it means the UN agencies. The UN was established to end the scourge of war. Obviously, it can't do that by itself, and it doesn't do that by itself, but it is the core purpose. It was invented by our greatest president in the United States in our history, Franklin Roosevelt, for the purpose of surmounting the underlying reasons for World War II and World War I, the geopolitics, the arms races, the lack of global rule of law. And so ending wars, making peace is the core business. I'm in another part of the UN activities, which is economic development, and that's important. And also the human rights side is important, but the core of the UN is about peace. And I think the UN till today is not doing enough in all of those contexts to end this war. Now, what we hear from the rhetoric in our mainstream media in the United States is, well, Putin is a Hitler, and he has to be stopped, and we have to defeat him. And it's as simple as that. And there's no talking to him. The man is crazed, living in a dream world of Russian imperialism. There's no stopping him. Any agreement is to rip up a piece of paper. I can tell you, since I'm an old guy now, 67, I've lived through this characterization. Every decade, there's a new Hitler that we can't deal with, whether it was Ho Chi Minh or whether it was Vietnam or whether it was Cambodia or Laos or Nicaragua, for heaven's sake, or Iraq or Syria. We are real good at this game of rhetoric, but this is not real. And since I am all over the world, virtually all the time, speaking with world leaders, what we hear in our media is propaganda. It is not real. We should be negotiating. Actually, Biden refused to negotiate with Putin in 2021 because Putin raised a very specific set of points. One was NATO enlargement. And then there's a chorus here that says, oh, that's a phony issue. That's a red herring. That's fake. That's not fake. I've been in this issue since 1990, when the West promised Gorbachev no NATO enlargement. We're liars. I'm sorry to put it that way. We cheated. We continue to do this. And then Biden refused to negotiate. Okay, that's straightforward, except it's not the way the story is told. Then there is the question of Ukraine itself, which is an ethnically divided country because there is a significant Russian minority. And those are real issues, by the way, although war is not an answer to them in any sense. But there was a very complicated, very difficult conflict where the U.S. was stirring the pot also back in a decade ago, and especially around 2014 and 2015. And there were actually agreements reached for the area where the fighting is raging right now, for the Donbas region. And the agreements were called the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. They were signed by the Ukraine government. And then the government said, no, we don't want to do those. And when Putin says, well, what about the Minsk agreements? He is shouted down or ignored. No, they don't exist. They were unfair. They were this, they were that. They were actually agreements. When I say this, oh, I can only tell you how many emails I'm going to get from, Ukrainian Canadians, Ukrainian Americans. Sachs, are you crazy? What are you saying? But the truth is, diplomacy is crucial if you're going to avoid wars. Signing agreements matters. You can't just walk away from them. That's true of Russia, I'm the first to say. It's true of Ukraine also. It's true of the United States also. And so we actually should be sitting down and negotiating. And all of our media don't discuss substance of what this war is really about, or what its roots are, or even what the claims of Putin are. Just say repeatedly, he's Hitler, he's a madman, he's out of control, there's nothing to do but defeat him. That's our mantra. That kind of mantra can get us all killed if we go down this road, because it's false and it's extraordinarily dangerous, because like it or not, we don't like it, but Russia has 1,600 active nuclear warheads, and we don't even want to sit down to talk. And shame on our government not to have diplomacy with Russia. At least sit, talk, discuss, and explain. We don't do that. We just say victory, victory, victory on the battlefield. Well, I'm not in it for that, because this is a very dangerous and very unwise approach.
It's incredibly destructive, and escalating this crisis is, as you mentioned, it only gets scarier, more damaging, and more destructive from there. So what would a reasonable outcome be from your perspective? What, if you're President Zelensky, what would you accept to get to a peaceful resolution to what's going on now?
This agreement was actually on the table back in the end of March, and then Ukraine walked away from it, from what I understand, because the U.S. told them walk away from it. We're providing the weapons, and the U.S. and even more the UK, which which is a more experienced empire than the U.S. and has a mindset, even though it's, the empire is long gone, but they still have an imperial mindset that is even more imperial than our mindset. They said to the Ukrainians, don't negotiate. You don't have to. Just beat them on the field. So what was on the table at the end of March was basically neutrality for Ukraine so that NATO and Russia wouldn't be right up against the border with each other, which is incredibly dangerous. Because if you have the two forces right up against each other, you are in a tripwire of nuclear war. We should have a zone where we're apart, where there's some time to talk, some time to work out problems for deconfliction. But no, we wanted to be right up against the border. But what Zelensky said back in the end of March was neutrality. Neutrality with guarantees. Okay, that's a very valid issue. How is that neutrality going to be protected? But that was point one. Point two was something on the Donbass. Even I said, okay, Minsk 1, Minsk 2 were signed. You can't just walk away from those agreements. You have to do something about them. The third, which is everybody, by the way, on the inside acknowledges there's no answer, is Crimea. Because Crimea is a really weird story of Russia's seaport on the Black Sea, its naval base in Sverdlovsk. So fundamental for Russian security. But Khrushchev in 1954, of course, in what was then a completely symbolic gesture, when the Soviet Union had administrative lines that were within an overall state. He said, okay, we gift Crimea from Russia to Ukraine. It didn't mean anything when there was a Soviet army and Soviet naval base and all the rest. But after 1991, it certainly meant something. And what happened in 2014 was the pro-Russian president was overthrown. Russia views that as a US instigated coup. There is something to that, I know, actually. But again, this is one of those things that the Western media simply will not discuss. And it's so deeply hidden in classified documents that maybe in 50 years, someone will write a good book about Ukraine 2014 if we get to 50 years from now. But in 2014, the Russian President Yanukovych was overthrown. And at that moment, Putin seized Crimea. And there was a referendum, hard to know much about it, but Crimea became part of Russia. Okay, just to say 3 issues on the table, neutrality, the Donbass, and Crimea. And Crimea, the basic answer was, oh my God, okay, we continue to negotiate, it's a frozen conflict. The Donbass, something like the Minsk agreements, and neutrality. And then the government of Ukraine walked away from this, even after reports that there was close to an agreement. Then we have our defense secretary and our State Department, which used to be diplomats, but now it's warriors, saying we're going to defeat Russia. And so everything went away about the negotiations. So that's the long-winded answer to your question, that we weren't so far from actually having a negotiated outcome. And then Ukraine walked away, I think, under the instigation of the United States.